Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. And welcome to Talking with Teachers. I'm your host, Dr. Abdullah bin Hamid Ali. And our guest today is Dr. Khalid Blankinship. Dr. Khalid Blankinship, he obtained his BA in history in 1973 from the University of Washington, an MA in teaching English as a foreign language in 1975 from the American University in Cairo, and an MA in Islamic history in 1983 from Cairo University. His PhD in history is from the University of Washington in 1988. After traveling extensively in Europe and the Middle East, Dr. Khalid, he long resided in Egypt for 11 years and in Saudi Arabia and Mecca for 1 year, becoming fluent in both classical and colloquial Arabic. He also resided for shorter periods in Jerusalem, Lebanon, Houston, Texas, and most recently, Amman, Jordan. Blankinship taught English for several years at the American University in Cairo, and then history at the University of Washington. In 1990, Blankinship moved to Philadelphia, where he was appointed in the Department of Religion at Temple University. He has served as chair of the Department of Religion between 1998 to 2002, the departmental graduate director from 2003 to 2013, and chair again from 2013 to 2017. I believe he's a chair as well right now. Anyway, there's a whole lot we could say about Dr. Khalid Blankinship. He's also one of my teachers when I studied at Temple University. Dr. Khalid he taught me in multiple of his special doctoral courses. And also we spent some private time in his office reading classical texts. He is definitely a father figure. He's taught me quite a bit, someone I love. And so I'd like to welcome Dr. Khalid Blankinship. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam wa barakatuh. Thank you.
MashaAllah. It's really a pleasure to have you with us, Dr. Khalid. Thank you for agreeing to the interview. Now, of course, when we have our calls, we have a tendency of being on the phone for a long time, and that's largely because I'm listening to you teach. Because, mashallah, Allah has blessed you so much, and we definitely want to make sure that our community benefits from your wisdom. And we know that, of course, you're not on the lecture circuit, and a lot of people may not be very familiar with you. I wanted to begin with a fundamental question about who you are, right? Of course, I've read some academic history, right? But I mean, what's your family background? How did you start your journey to where you are today? And whatever you'd like to share, please do proceed, inshallah.
Well, I don't think the purpose of this is so much to go into my family background, although I could do that very extensively. But half of my ancestors came from Norway between 1866 and 1885 to the United States, and the other half came from the British Isles between before 1800, and so the Blankinship ancestor came to America in 1686 and so on. Mm-hmm. So this is family background, family religious background. All four of my grandparents, although of Protestant Christian origin, were not religious. And my parents were also not very religious, even though they did take us to the Congregational Church, which became the United Church of Christ for a few years. And I gave that up because of biblical criticism. And so it took me a long time to come back to religion, even though I was always interested in it. And I did embrace Islam in 1973 in Seattle, Washington, after I had already traveled in the Middle East. And so I had already learned Arabic, and I was sitting in my room reading the Quran aloud. And that was actually what brought me to Islam, through the meanings of the Quran in Arabic. So I don't make any special case for myself being any special thing, because it took me to, actually experience this in Arabic in order to become a Muslim. And many people become Muslims without doing that.
Right. So you actually knew Arabic before you accepted Islam?
Yes, that's correct.
MashaAllah, that's very special and unique in a lot of ways. And what would you say guided you or brought you to Islam? What is it that attracted you?
Well, I think that Islam is the true and correct religion because it is a direct connection with Allah, or with God, if you prefer. It's a very simple teaching, a simple connection that there is Allah and we worship Allah, we believe in Allah, and Allah has created us, and so on. And like any religion that does, of course, have complexities as you elaborate it out, but at least it doesn't have things between the worshiper and Allah that interfere. I would regard it as the clear statement, and that's my reason for my preference for Islam over every other religion.
Well, how about your academic journey? I mean, of course, you were already studying Arabic, and what brought you to that? Yeah, what sparked you to study of Arabic?
Well, I was always interested in history. And I am a historian, and I regard that as my main thing. But I was in the university studying ancient history, Roman history. I studied Greek and Latin, and I went traveling for various reasons, because there were people who traveled, and I was young then, and everyone had their young and foolish part. But on the other hand, I did also travel with the intention of visiting the Roman ruins around the Mediterranean Sea. So I visited that area and visited about 30 ruined Roman and Greek sites, Roman and Greek cities. And in doing that, I found the Arabic-speaking world, which is half of the lands bordering the Mediterranean Sea, that this was a living society that was going on right now. And furthermore, it seemed to me that it was more together as a society than our own society was. Because back in the day, we were, hippies, and we had the, counterculture thing, and we were trying to, resist connections with our parents and so on, as the Arabs seemed to the contrary, very together, and everyone was interested and concerned about their families and so on. So that made me think, well, I should, go back and change my attitudes on these things, which I did. And it also caused me, in going back to finish my BA degree in history, to switch from studying ancient history to studying Islam. And while I was doing that, I discovered the Quran first in English translation, when we were using the Pickthall translation back in the day to, be just detailed and clear. And then that led me eventually to reading the Quran in Arabic, mainly to practice my Arabic, because the Quran mushakkal, it has the vowels in it. And so that way you can practice reading aloud more easily than, say, if you're reading a book or the newspaper, because it has all the vowels in it. And as reading that drew me back into the idea of embracing the religion.
Right, mashallah. Right. So I remember you spoke about how you were heavily into astrology at one time.
Well, yeah, I mean, I even took a course in astrology from an astrologer. I did horoscopes for people. I had a pile of astrology books. And the day I became a Muslim, I gave all the books away, because I decided that if God wanted me to know something, I would be informed of it. And if he wanted to conceal something from me, I would never be able to figure it out through astrology. So I left astrology aside.
Right. And so astrology, I would imagine is connected with astronomy too. So it seems that is also like one of your, areas of expertise has been astronomy. Would you say that?
Well, I don't know if I call it expertise, but I would call it interest, because astronomy is my favorite science, and the astronomy, cosmology, studying the totality of the cosmos, I found that most attractive. And in some of my teaching, when I've taught religion and science, for example, and even now when I teach earth ethics, I include an element from astronomy and from cosmology in it, because these are kind of ultimate things about the structure of the universe, the fate of the universe. And I've tried to keep current on those things also. But I wouldn't be able to do any original research in that. That would be a different matter. But I do try to follow that yes, I'm very interested in astronomy also.
Right. And at Temple, I mean, what are like some of the sort of courses that you taught over the years?
Yeah, over the years at Temple, I was hired originally to teach subjects dealing with Islam. At the graduate level, I have taught many courses on Islam, which include the foundations in Islam, the Seerah of the Prophet, the biography of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the classical Muslim history, modern Muslim movements, which is the look at the modern Muslim world. And I have also taught hadith, and I have taught Islamic jurisprudence and Islamic mysticism, tasawwuf. So I've taught all of those at the undergraduate level. I have taught more general courses like religion in the world, for example, that used to be called Introduction to Religion. I have taught racial justice, which is now called Race and Poverty in the Americas, because they changed the course names. I have taught Introduction to Islam. I've taught Islam in America. I've taught Islamic mysticism. Those at the undergraduate level. And recently I have come to teach Earth Ethics as the main course that I've been teaching.
MashaAllah, tabarakallah. That's quite a profile there. All right. And, so we definitely, we feel blessed to know you. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve you and grant you long life.
I feel blessed to know you too.
I feel blessed that you feel blessed.
Alhamdulillah.
The thing, I mean, of course, you've written quite a bit over the years, and one of your articles that I actually stumbled across, or someone sent it to me some years ago, related to developing a methodology or Muslim methodology of historical critique, or however you expressed it, and I actually utilized that in my hadith course, so and couple of things that are really interesting from it were that you talked about how if Muslims were to embrace our own sort of historical methodology, that we would need to include the viewpoints of other or non-Muslim civilizations, which hasn't been the case in the past because of our sort of attitude towards like things like the Israeliyat, and that also that fundamentally that history should be seen as the struggle to, I guess you would say, to recapture or to reconnect with our mission as servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, the ups and downs of that, of course, you express it in a much more eloquent way. And so I found that to be very profound, and students really like that as well, right? When they actually read it, because of course that's just one example, just an article, an essay you had written before, but of course we know they also have other books, So could you sort of maybe list like maybe names of some of your other works?
Oh, my works. Well,
yeah.
There's my doctoral thesis published as a book, The End of the Jihad State, the Reign of Hisham ibn Abdul Malik and the Collapse of the Umayyads, which is about early Muslim history. And there are the 2 volumes that I translated for the Tabari Translation Project, Volume 11 and Volume 25, which is a 38-volume set of the probably greatest of the early Muslim historians, Abu Ja'far al-Tabari, and that's translated into English. And then there are the recent books that I have done, which are the
Murshid al-Qari,
there's Murshid for you all in 2021, Murshid al-Qari, A Reader's Guide to Classical Muslim Religious Literature in English. The volume deals with the Quran and the tafsir. And then there's the Inimitable Quran, Some Rhetorical Problems in Translating the Quran, published in 2019 by Brill in the Netherlands. And so those are more recent publications. So those are my books, such as they are. And then I have several investigative articles also One of them is the arrest of the Imam Ibrahim ibn Muhammad and the Abbasid Revolution. And that deals with a revision of how the Abbasid Revolution took place, and in particular with some details of the historical transformation from the Umayyad or transition from the Umayyad to the Abbasid Caliphate, which had not been brought to light before. And there's also an article on in the book titled Fundamentalism on the unsuitability of the use of the term fundamentalism for academic use, both because it is ill-defined and because it has become kind of a term of abuse. And I take examples of some writers who are assumed to be or called fundamentalists and point out that they really do not have the kind of characteristics that the people are talking about, or the other characteristics that they have, which may or may not be objectionable, are not related to the concept of so-called fundamentalism. And furthermore, that fundamentalism itself has an underlying flaw in that it really means the idea of getting down to the basics has to do with getting down to the scientific basics of fundamentals. And so the real fundamentalism, if you like it, in the modern world is primarily the fundamentalism of people who I would call followers of scientism, not scientists, but people who insist on making science the high thing overall, are actually fundamentalists in that sense, in that they will reject everything else. It has to be coming according to what they consider scientific proof, when actually science itself has a very lot of ragged edges and uncertainties. So that was another thing. Another article I wrote was about the succession of to the Prophet ﷺ at the Saqifat Bani Sa'ida, and the prominence of Zayd ibn Haritha in the entourage of the Prophet ﷺ, and how there's even this hadith where Aisha says that if Zayd had lived, he would have been the successor, and that Usama ibn Zayd was preferred by the Prophet because of his affection for Zayd, who had died, even though Usama was just a young person, and then he was put aside. But actually, the Prophet had been trying to establish the principle of equality among everyone here, because Zayd ibn Haritha, of course, had been enslaved, so he was considered a former slave, and yet nevertheless the Prophet promoted him as being like the second in command while he was still living. Right,
yeah. We've spoken about this perhaps on a number of occasions, but I mean, of course, as a historian who's looked at both the Western tradition and also familiar with the Islamic historical tradition, what sort of problems would you say exists in Islamic history, or I guess you would say, or the attempt to, I guess you would say, articulate a truly I don't know, perhaps an authentic or unproblematic Islamic history, right? In other words, I think it was you who actually made it clear to me that, for instance, Imam Tabari, he relies heavily on Sayf ibn Umar as one of his sources for a number of historical reports, and so when you read about Sayf ibn Umar in the books of Rijal, for instance, like Ibn Hajar Ashqalani, mentioned that he's wahin fil hadith, umdatun fil tarikh, that he's weak in hadith, but he's a pretty much a pillar of history, right? That he's relied heavily upon, and he becomes like the apparently the single source for the reports about Abdullah ibn Saba, right? And it seems that the scholars of Islam were not as concerned with authenticity to the same extent as they were with respect to the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You know, so they weren't concerned about authenticity or just really a rigorous sort of critique of the asanid or any particular approach that would, what I guess you would say, help them to preserve a truly sound version of Islamic history. Because now Sunnis and Shiites, they differ on certain points of Islamic history. You know, so what would you say are some of the challenges of trying to reconcile some of the conflicts between different Muslim factions or different versions of history?
Yeah, well, that's quite a lot you put there. The thing is that, of course, there was a kind of early disparagement of Muslim history by Orientalists, and that would be more than 100 years ago. And then there was a counter movement against that among later Orientalists to be a little bit deeper digging and more understanding in it, and so on. And then there was a counter movement to that made a general assault on all of the early Muslim history. And the Muslims have responded to this by now. It took quite a long time for them to become engaged with these other discourses that were sometimes hostile, but they did eventually engage with them. And the problem of early Muslim history is that the sources are vast and more sources become available all the time. The Saif ibn Omar, whom you were referring to, I was doing research on that person in the 80s, and then in the early 90s, his book, which had been lost and was only known from its being embedded in Tabri's history, was the book itself was discovered with all kinds of new traditions that had not been recorded by Tabari. And frankly, the newly discovered book made him look worse, actually, overall. But a manuscript was discovered that had been in Iraq previously, and it was acquired by some Saudi. And the Saudis then presented that, and Qasim as-Samarai, who is an Iraqi scholar, I believe, living in Europe, published it. And so there's always a lot of change, a lot of sources come into view. And the trouble is, that the Islamic history is received by the conventional wisdom. First of all, it's not a unified history anyway. That is, there isn't any official version of it. There are various versions. Right. And these versions have, over the centuries, transformed the tradition of it in various ways. And this was inevitable to happen. And as the different tendencies in Islam took form and gelled, which include particularly the Sunni Shia cleavage or split, which is the biggest one, the defenders of these traditions fitted the history according to their own view in order to go along with what they had then as doctrines. And this obscured certain early historical processes that were happening. For one thing, everyone in religion has to carry back their own position to the point of origin. So everything whatsoever is traced back to the Prophet ﷺ, and hardly anything is traced back to any successor or anyone after that, even though, of course, development was going on. Now, that doesn't mean that the whole religion developed into something different. That's not what I'm saying at all, of course. But it does mean that certain particular points, the emphasis on them changed, and sometimes things were obscured and so on. And one of those things that was obscured was the lateness of the actual formulation of both the Sunni and the Shia doctrines. You cannot say that Sunnism per se existed before the Abbasid revolution in 132-750, nor did Shiaism in its later form. Shiaism existed as the name Shiat Ali from an earlier time, but that was a political party more than a religious sect. And the religious differences were exceedingly slight. And all of that then became canonized into different positions at a later date. And now to try to elaborate on any of this early history in a way that contradicts what some cherished views of history may be, brings out very great rage in people that they rage. So an example of that would be, for example, the Umayyads' cursing of Ali. The Umayyad caliphs, although it can't be documented exactly every year to which this practice went on, but it appears from the very beginning of the reign of Muawiyah, at least through to the end of the reign of Sulaiman ibn Abdul Malik, that the Umayyads normally cursed Ali as part of the ritual of Jum'ah prayer after the Friday prayer, when they would say prayers for the Khalifa, and they would call down curses on Ali in the khutbahs. And modern Muslims, Sunni Muslims, find this just impossible to believe. And they say, oh, well, what's the proof of that? And so one of the tendencies of our Salafi brethren, some of them, is to say, well, we only rely on the Kitab al-Badaya wa Nihaya of Ibn Kathir for history, and that's it. Well, that would be a very simplistic solution, which is amongst the kinds of simplistic solutions that some people try to engage in, where you just have one text that becomes absolutely authoritative. Well, guess what? In Kitab al-Badaya wa Nihaya, Ibn Kathir reports the cursing of Ali. By Muawiyah and by other Umayyad caliphs. And so if you're going to be sticking to that, then what are you going to do? And that might even lead to someone saying, well, we don't want to have history at all. We don't want to deal with history. Oh, but come on. How can we understand who we are, what we are, and so on, unless we deal with history? We have to deal with all the history of the world. The Muslims have to consider every history, even the history of Japan, or some, place that has hardly had anything to do historically with Islam. They have to explain all history and how all of that relates together. If we are going to present it also as something related to our religion, then we have to explain how it is that there were all these people that did all this and that and the other thing in every other which place. So I think that if that's the case, then we're also at least going to have to explain our Muslim history to ourselves. And sometimes that is difficult because, of course, people don't want to have or admit that there is any conflict among the Sahaba whatsoever. And they want to expunge any trace of blame that attaches to the Sahaba and radiallahu anhum and so on. And maybe a better way to go would be to say, well, the Sahaba were all doing what they thought was right, but they did come into conflict. And that's quite palpably obvious. And it simply won't do to try to load all of the blame on some obscure figure. They claim, oh, it's all the fault of Abdullah ibn Saba. Oh, really? Well, if Abdullah ibn Saba went around raising all the Sahaba against each other and succeeded in doing that, then that makes the Sahaba look like a bunch of dunces. So what are you doing here, really? You aren't actually helping matters by saying that.
Yeah, I've actually seen some scholars, one particular scholar actually claimed that the reason that Abdullah ibn Saba was able to actually do the things he supposedly did was because the Sahaba themselves, that their hearts were so pure, they were innocent, and they were a bit naive, and so that's why it was possible, right? Where he was this individual person, he was very wicked, and they themselves, and it really doesn't make a lot of sense to say, okay, well, that this person finds his way to the upper echelons of the Sahaba, who themselves were a converted community. And when you're a convert, you know a little bit about like deception and what we call game and those type of things, so it's hard to imagine that it was just simply a case of people being gullible and just not being able to detect the machinations of one individual, right? And been responsible for all these different conflicts. I mean, another thing too about like Bidayah wa Nihaya was interesting too. Back when I prepared a lecture from that particular work is on the question of who's responsible for the death of Imam Hasan, radiallahu an, that he actually reports both the claim that it was Yazid ibn Muawiyah who was responsible, right, for poisoning him through sending a woman to Imam Hasan to marry. And then he also relates the version that says Muawiyah was also, radiallahu anhu, was actually responsible for it. So that there's a bit of a dilemma. So if you say we're going to rely only on Bidayah wa Nihaya, and I've also found interesting too is when even the subject of Yazid ibn Muawiyah comes up, looking at various histories, we find some of them, who paint Yazid in very positive light. So it's very difficult to really know exactly, if many of the accusations made against him were actually true, right? But of course most Muslims operate as if like, well, yeah, this is it's clear what happened and what he did and what type of person he was.
Well, that's why we have to examine what the sources are for various statements, and we have to, question the interests of people who were passing down stuff. Like if we look at the successor of Hisham ibn Abdul Malik, who is al-Walid ibn Yazid ibn Abdul Malik, who is called al-Walid II, who reigned for only 14 months and then was killed in a coup which practically ended Umayyad rule. The leaders of the coup who put Yazid ibn al-Walid ibn Abdul Malik, or Yazid III, into office, who only was caliph for a few months, had a great reform program because the Umayyad policy was too extreme in favoring one faction that had alienated everyone. So they were, threatened with downfall, which did indeed overtake them. Well, anyway, that people who originated that coup against Walid ibn Yazid and killed him in the year 744 of the Common Era, or 126 of the Hijrah, I believe, they denounced al-Walid with all kinds of denunciations. They said that he was a drunkard, that he would swim in a swimming pool and invite singing girls to jump naked into the pool with him, and the pool was not filled with water but with wine, and he would drink the wine so that the level of the pool would go down noticeably. And they also said that he was a homosexual, and they said that he most notoriously that he shot the Quran full of arrows. This is very famous, that he shot, and all of that is just propaganda against him. It's just palpably, obviously lies and propaganda. And that, even though I'm not someone who defends the Umayyad Caliphate particularly, but in this particular instance, I have to say, yeah, that's just propaganda. And so one has to try to distinguish all of these statements with regard to the poisoning of al-Hasan and so on. All of the Shia imams, of the 12 imams, except for the ones that was killed directly, which is Hussein, and Ali, who was assassinated by a Kharijite, the other 10 were ostensibly all, well, not the 10, the other 9, because the 12th imam, of course, went into office. The other 9 were all poisoned. And this is a historical problem of poisoning, because if you look at poisoning throughout history and other non-Muslim histories as well, you cannot possibly know whether it ever was poisoning or not. Now, in modern times, maybe you can sometimes, like the Arctic expedition of Sir John Franklin. I think it was accused that he was murdered by being given arsenic, and because his body was frozen in the permafrost, that they actually found it, and they found, yes, he had arsenic in his body. So in that case, it was kind of proven that someone did him in. Well, that's fine. But if you go back to ancient history and medieval history, you cannot tell if someone was poisoned. Now, the Roman Emperor Claudius was poisoned according to an extremely elaborate story, which even names the woman who prepared the poison, and that Claudius ate this particularly succulent mushroom. And so, however, that's in the histories that were written down some decades later. But in a attack on Claudius that was written as soon as he had died, there's no mention of that. And it seems like that might have been something completely fabricated out of the whole cloth later. Well, that has at least an elaborate story, and it is usually assumed, oh yeah, this story is plausible, Claudius was poisoned. Well, maybe not, maybe he wasn't. And so when we come to something as vague as al-Hasan, where there isn't any detailed story about it, to say, oh, of course he was poisoned. Oh, really? Well, why? Why would Muawiyah bother to poison someone who is as quiescent and non-active against him as al-Hasan? That is just majorly improbable. There isn't any, it cannot be proven that he wasn't poisoned. That can't be proven either, but it just doesn't seem to me to be plausible. And then some of the other imams whose deaths are very vague, like Ali Zain al-Abidin and Muhammad al-Baqir and Ja'far as-Sadiq, there's no evidence that they were poisoned. That's just a saying, see, in order to make them all martyrs. That's it.
Right. So, I mean, so could we say that when it comes to Islam's sacred history, or rather say the what we know about the Seerah of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, that we can have relative confidence that the general outlines and perhaps most of the fine details about what we know about his Seerah are reliable, but it becomes less reliable the further out we kind of go, with, you know, minor exceptions, or maybe
one thing is the Seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, that is something that was very definitely a concern early on. And therefore, the history of the Prophet ﷺ is much better established than the history of the Rashidun Caliphs. There was much more concern for accuracy of detail early on there, because the Muslims really cared about their prophet. And so it's said that the Urwa ibn Zubayr had a history of the prophet already. And Urwa ibn Zubayr, of course, is, although he's not a companion, he's a tabi'i, because he was born after the Prophet ﷺ had died. But nevertheless, he's a very early person in Islam, an early tabi'i. And so there was already a concern for this that was going on, say, in the latter half or the latter part of the 7th century, or the latter part of the 1st century of the Hijrah. There was already this interest going on. And there was a possibility through the memories of people of remembering a very great deal about it. And so that then is recorded and gathered together by the 5 great sources for the Seerah, which are Ibn Hisham and al-Waqidi and al-Maghazi, and al-Baladhiri in Ansab al-Ashraf, and the Tabari in his history, and Ibn Sa'd in his Tabaqat. And these are the 5 big sources. And there also are other sources that are not related to those, that are small sources that don't have as much contribution to make. After all, Ibn Sa'd has 2 whole volumes out of the 9 are the Seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. So you have this huge amount of material handed down. And for the later on, it's not as clearly done in the and not done in as much detail. And the disdain that in which the Umayyads were held is shown by the lack of biographical detail for the Umayyad caliphs, even though there was a Umayyad tradition that survived, which is represented partly by or inside of Kitab and Ansab al-Ashraf of al-Baladhiri, for example. But in general, there was a kind of disdain for them. So when I wrote about Hisham ibn Abdul Malik, It's hard to say much about his life in general. I mean, I only, in my whole book about his reign, there are only about 2 pages that were about himself. And, you know, he had this advisor called al-Abrash al-Kalbi, who was a Syrian Arab there from, you know, the people that supported him, who were the Syrian army. And nothing is known about this person. I mean, hardly anything. And there's also Rajab bin Haywa, who had something to do with the Caliphate of Omar ibn Abdulaziz. And as important as that is, also very little is known about this person. And so so the elaboration about the Sahaba tends to be somewhat more. And you can say, yes, definitely the general outline is good. It's clear. One of the attacks of the Cronites, which were the people who were on the offensive against early Islamic history and its accuracy.
With Patricia Crone,
Patricia Crone, the Danish Orientalist, and her collaborator, Michael Cook, for example, and other collaborators of her, and so on, and other people who continue to write in the same vein. Was that they said, well, let's just do the thought experiment, reject the entire Islamic tradition and rely only on the non-Islamic sources, which are mainly Middle Eastern Christian historians, all of whom wrote somewhat later, although some of them are really early and very important, like Sebios or Pseudo-Sebios, the Armenian historian, who is thought to have written around the year 660. That would be just about 30 years after the Prophet ﷺ had died. Very important. But what does Pseudo-Sebios say in his Armenian history? First of all, he's in Armenia, which is far away, so you wouldn't expect that would contain anything much accurate. But on the contrary, he has the campaign of Mu'tah in the thing, where he says that the Muslim invasion of Syria originally appeared at Rabath, Moab, which is today Rabbah, which is the town that's just a stone's throw from Mu'tah, the location of that battle site. It's an exact agreement. And then they would try to say, oh, Sebios proves the blah, blah, blah. No, it doesn't. It proves the opposite. It proves the Muslim historical tradition is accurate. One of Krona's students, Robert Hoyland, wrote a book, I think titled Islam as Others Saw It, in which he gathered all the sources, the non-Muslim sources for the early period in Islam for the first 100 years of the Hijrah or so. And he gathered all the historical sources, everything, and he wrote and translated them. So it's all found translated, every single thing. You can read every single thing that all these other sources said. And then he also put in as an appendix in the very same volume all the early Muslim inscriptions and contemporary things. So he left out later historians. He only included the early stuff, see. And it doesn't produce a different narrative at all. And he said that. He said, well, looking at all this, it doesn't really produce a different narrative from the Muslim historical narrative. I mean, there's some, he would say, you know, because these were Christian writers and some of them disliked the Muslims, and so they may have said some unfavorable things here and there. But on the whole, there's nothing that goes against the mainstream historical tradition of Islam. And I myself, looking at these things, I fail to see anything that goes against that in any major way. But that does not mean that we can just take the historical tradition and say this is all true, because first of all, when we readmit the Muslim historical books and look at them all in detail, they are not in agreement with each other about lots of stuff. They have lots of things that they do not have a united narrative on. And that makes it possible for one to say, well, then what is the fact about this, that, or the other thing? And to investigate things in detail and to take them apart. And when you do that, then you start to see how certain tendencies arose to emphasize certain people and their importance at the expense of others who were de-emphasized or they're still mentioned because the tradition mentions everybody. And the tradition was very reluctant to throw out anything that came down. So the traditions usually recite also the authentic things. I've taken an example is al-Mu'akhad, the brothering. Now the brothering actually happened. And it was a brilliant stroke from the Prophet ﷺ when he brought these Meccans who were from a completely different tribal group, about 80 adult males and their families in the initial hijrah to Medina. And here they came in on this oasis where the whole place is really poor. And Medina was not particularly poor, but Arabia was really pretty poor, and people lived poorly in those days. And so to bring in all of these people, probably several hundred people, to come in all at once, that could just create a big problem. And it could be, viewed as an invasion by another tribal group or so. So the Prophet ﷺ said, okay, I will solve this by making each Meccan into the brother of a Medinan. So each Meccan male will be given to a Medinan male to take care of. And they will make actual brothers. And it said, Mu'akhad, the making of brotherhood. And then it says in the tradition that the Prophet took Ali's hand and said, this is my brother Ali. And then it says in the little note in the same book, and it is said also that the Prophet made Ali the brother of Sahl ibn Hunayf. Now, of course, the idea the Prophet made Ali his brother is something that is just absolutely solidly established, but it is tendentious. Now, could it have happened? Yes, it could have happened that at some point the Prophet said, Ali is my brother. But also, it did not happen at the Mu'akhad because it would have no function there. And it would simply create problems and jealousy, and it would be a completely useless move. Rather, the point was to make each Qurayshi, make a Medinan the responsibility responsible for each Quraysh. And so Ali was made the brother of Sahl ibn Hunayf. And then later on, when Ali became Khalifa in circumstances that were somewhat revolutionary, however one construes that whole event, he immediately appointed Uthman ibn Hunayf, Sahl's brother, as the governor of Basra, and appointed Sahl ibn Hunayf as the governor of Egypt, even though Sahl ibn Hunayf was never able to take that position because Egypt did not remain loyal to Ali. And so obviously there's a lot of consequence. And one can even say in the defense of Ali that Ali, being one of the younger companions, had grown up more with the idea of the universality of Islam and had grown up with less of a tribal commitment than the other persons had. And because of that, he was able to make friends with the Ansar and become their supporter, and the Ansar became the champions for him. And that came out later on in the fitna.
Right. MashaAllah. Well, what I try to do typically towards the end of each one of these interviews is to ask the guests a question about a particular personality who you believe perhaps deserves more attention by the Muslims or just people in general. And so on the way up to this particular interview, you had mentioned that you wanted to speak a little bit about the Caliph, al-Nāṣir, al-Abbasi. What is it, or if there is there something special about him that made you feel that he deserves to be showcased? What are those things? And we'd like to hear, what your thoughts are on that.
Yes. I think that, again, this subject would take more time than a few minutes, and I'll try to make the point as brief as I can about why al-Nasir and his caliphate which lasted as a caliph from 1180 to 1225 of the Common Era, or 575 to 622 of the Hijri era. The reason for this caliph, the 34th of 37 Abbasid caliphs, being so important is that he presented a program for the restoration of the Abbasid Caliphate to actual power over the world as being the presiders over all of Islam, the whole Muslim world. And he, in effect, put his best foot forward for this in thinking very deeply and carefully about it, and in establishing all kinds of institutions whereby he tried to establish the legitimacy of such a move. Now, it's of course important to note that the Abbasid Caliphate had lost its political power, starting with the coup that killed al-Mutawakkil in 861, centuries before al-Nasir came on the scene. That would be 300 plus years before al-Nasir. And then the caliphs were dominated by Turkish generals, and then by the Buyids, who were Daylamite Shi'is from near the Caspian Sea for 110 years. And then the Buyids were thrown out by the Seljuk Turks, who said they were restoring the caliphate, but would not allow the caliphs to have any power. And so the Seljuk Sultanate gradually weakened and disintegrated. And when this happened, the caliphs were able to restore their power because they still had that Abbasid lineage. And the people would say, wow, you know, the descendants of Abbas, the Prophet's uncle, the al-Bayt, the people who have a kind of legitimacy. And furthermore, they had not alienated the public for centuries because they had had no power for centuries. And the caliphs had tried earlier to regain power, like the Caliph al-Qadir in, I believe, about 1018, issued an aqidah called al-Aqidah al-Qadiriyah, named after him. And this aqidah was very much the Hanbali aqidah. Right. So they tended to cling to the Hanbali school, and the Hanbali school was popular in Baghdad. It was maybe not completely dominant, but somewhat so. And they then, you know, fluctuated between the Hanbali and the Shafi'i for a while before coming back to Hanbali. Anyway, that's all before al-Nasir. About 1152, the great-grandfather of al-Nasir was able to recover temporal authority in the city of Baghdad and exclude the Seljuk Turks from ruling the city anymore. But there were still Turkish generals that they had to use to establish their power. So it was not until 1175 that the Caliph Nasir's father, al-Muqtadi, was able to get rid of the Turkish general. And after that, the Caliph was really in office and power finally in Baghdad and in the small area in southern Iraq that they were able to conquer, including al-Hilla and al-Wasit and also eventually al-Basra. They dominated an area that was smaller than the present-day country of Iraq, which is a very small part of the Muslim world. And in that area, they had real temporal power, real power of political authority. And they tried to use the caliphal authority to beat the local rulers around them over the head with, because they said, well, we're the caliphs. You have to, you know, respect us, and you should do what we want, or at least you have to not threaten us and bother us and stuff like that. And they were, you know, fair to middling successful in doing that. And so al-Nasir came, and he had then adopted this full-blown program. So he established something called al-Fatuwa. Al-Fatuwa were organizations of young men that were kind of lodges, which had existed for a long time, and which were often considered to be criminals and highway robbers. So they might be something like mafia organizations even. And on the other hand, they also had principles and morals and moral teachings that they taught themselves. So al-Nasir usurped this for his own purpose and made himself the head of it. And he was named in the organization Qiblat al-Fityan. So he was their Qibla even. In other words, they had to have obeisance and so forth. And he then extended this organization over many countries. And he would send out the trousers, so the sirwal, which was the sign that the people were being inducted into this organization. And he also made it in his own realm into a kind of militia, whereby he gained a considerable military strength. This might have been suggested by the incident in his father's reign where the Turkish general Qaymaz tried to capture and depose the Caliph al-Muqtadi, and the Muqtadi stood up on the roof of his palace and called on the people, "People, help! Rescue me! Come!" And the people came running and drove out the Turkish general. So with all of that, there was a kind of idea of mass mobilization in it that is something like what modern states try to do. And that's very suggestive that al-Nasir was doing it. It's highly interesting that he was doing this. He also associated himself with Sufi sheikhs and Sufism, particularly the very, very famous, important Abu Hafs Omar al-Suhrawardi, who wrote the book Awarif al-Ma'arif, which is a Sufi manual that is of great importance down to this day, and who had something to do with the origin of Sufi orders. Because you will notice in Sufism, the Tawaf, that before this era, you go to a sheikh and it's just all very informal, and the sheikh dies and then you go to some other sheikh, and there's no continuity about it and there's no central organization of it. But it became centrally organized starting in the 13th century. After hundreds of years of Sufism with no Sufi orders, suddenly Sufi orders appeared. Well, could it be that al-Nasir's actions actually had something to do with precipitating this? If so, it was really important in Islamic history. And his relationship with Suhrawardi was very close. Suhrawardi was mostly very loyal to this Caliph al-Nasir, who reigned for 45 years. So he had a huge, long reign. And he even sent Suhrawardi on missions to other sultans to try to get them to agree with the Abbasid Caliph and so on. And he would send him out with writs of investiture, where Suhrawardi would say, okay, here now we're investing you with the Sultanate, which would put the Caliph above the Sultan. And that, in Nasir's mind, had the hope eventually of cowing these sultans and maybe getting rid of them the same way as his ancestors had gotten rid of the Turks and reestablished the Caliphate in this little area in Iraq. So there was that. He cultivated all of these sheikhs. And of course, you yourself translated that important work of Abdurrahman ibn al-Jawzi, for which I wrote the introduction. And on camera. Book right here, just for the attributes of God. And Ibn al-Jawzi was a hugely important sheikh. He wrote 700 books, and he was very controversialist in his life in attacking other people and having a lot of controversies and clashes. And he was also very popular. And that as a Hanbali sheikh, he came out against the other Hanbalis with this aqidah, because his aqidah got rid of a lot of the anthropomorphism that the Hanbalism was invested in. And even he helped move the other Hanbalis away from that somewhat as things developed later on. And Abdurrahman ibn al-Jawzi could not be captured easily by the Caliph. And for reasons that are not entirely clear, because there are several different versions of it, he exiled Ibn al-Jawzi for 5 years to Wasit. And then, because of Nasir's mother, Zamurrid, being a Hanbali partisan, she got Ibn al-Jawzi pardoned, and at the very end of his life, he came back in triumph, a very old man in his 80s, to Baghdad after the exile. And the Caliph al-Nasir was trying to balance all of the different factions. So he didn't like his ancestors' following of the Hanbali school. He wanted to be above that because as Caliph, he should be above it all, and he should be able to absorb all the schools, including the Shia. And so that gave him a reputation for either, being wimpy on the Shia or even being, favorable to the Shia. That he would be attacked somewhat on the basis of later. Well, to try to establish his credentials, he said, I am going to leave politics. I'm going to I will still be the Khalifa, but I will leave politics. I will let the Wazir rule the country and run things. And I am going to be a Sufi ascetic. I'm going to follow a strict regimen of zuhd and be ascetic. And I'm also going to study Islamic studies. So he became an authority in hadith. He took lessons in hadith. He transmitted the Musnad of Ibn Hanbal. So there might even be today some lineage of the transmission of the Musnad of Ibn Hanbal that goes through the Caliph and Nasir. Not satisfied with that, he wrote collected a book of hadith, 70 hadith himself, which is called Ruh al-Arifin. And even the use of al-Arifin suggests also the Sufi connection that he had. So he actually has his own hadith book, which for several centuries was very popular. And now recently I've been looking for it. I can't find it. And I'd love it if anyone would be able to find for me in Nasir's Ruh al-Arifin. And then later on, As-Suyuti, several centuries later, Suyuti died in 1505, the Egyptian sheikh said, well, this work, Ruh al-Arifin, really shouldn't be this popular because it is a work that was originated for political expediency and personal career making and not for the sake of religion. And that is a very, very important comment here because, of course, al-Nasir had outwardly all the correct attributes of someone who was a muhaddith. But on the other hand, here Suyuti was questioning the motives of al-Nasir because al-Nasir was also a politician, and there is the split. And the Suyuti himself was placed under house arrest by the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, Khalid Blankinship, so that the contest of the ulama with the sultan was something that continued. And that was where al-Nasir stuck himself in this way that is very, very suggestive and important. He also built ribats, which were Sufi education centers that were rivals to the madrasas that the Shafi'is had set up, the Nizamiya madrasas, and they had their effect. And he considered deposing his son from the succession because his son was too, Hanbali, probably. And when al-Nasir died in 1225, al-Zahir introduced a lot of reforms where he abolished al-Nasir's secret police network and system of informers and remitted taxes that al-Nasir had insisted on and so on, which illustrate the aspects of al-Nasir's reign that are absolutely obvious, usual political effects that you have to have. I mean, when, since the pharaohs of Egypt, has there been a government that didn't have intelligence services and secret police and stuff?
Right. Wasn't al-Zahir the Abbasid Caliph who actually was most responsible for normalizing the four schools, establishing the courts that offered preferential treatment to the four schools?
Well, al-Nasir did that. And
it wasn't.
Nasir was careful, for example, to transmit his hadith book, Ruh al-Arifin, to the sheikhs of all four schools in Baghdad. And all four schools were represented in Baghdad, where the Malikis had once been very prominent. By that time, they were kind of dying out in Baghdad. The Hanafis, that was the madhab of the Turks. So it had become somewhat less popular. But the Shafi'is and the Hanbalis were still really big, and the Shia were also big. And so these groups were actually clashing a lot. And there were riots and the burning of quarters and stuff. And there was a considerable disorder. And Nasir also instituted a greater degree of order by forcing it from his power as the ruler. And so when you look at all of this, if you look at modern today programs for establishing a caliphate, from the terrible problems of Daesh to the Hizb al-Tahrir al-Islami founded by Taqiyuddin al-Nabahani in the 1950s, which is very prominent in Jordan and in Uzbekistan and in Indonesia today. These parties that call for the restoration of the caliphate. And people often will say, oh, well, you have to believe in the caliphate. And you see what happened to Sheikh Ali Abdul Raziq of al-Azhar when he wrote Islam wa Usul al-Hukm in 1925, when the Ottomans had just been abolished by by Mustafa Kemal in Turkey, and in 1924 it abolished the caliphate. So Ali Abdul Raziq wrote a book saying, well, the caliphate is not in the Quran, it's not an actual institution that we need, there's no need for. And then he was ousted from al-Azhar and condemned generally. Well, we have to have the caliphate. Okay. So we pay lip service to the idea that we have to have a caliphate, even when we don't have a caliphate. Or we could say, if there's an existing caliph, obey him. Well, what about the Amir al-Mu'mineen, the king of Morocco? That's a caliph. What about the caliph of Sokoto in Nigeria? That's a caliph. So we have these lineages, even which still exist and may still claim the title. So are we going to multiply the lineages of caliphate by establishing other lineages then in opposition to them? I mean, shouldn't one canvass those first of all? And if you just don't like the incumbent in office, well, according to the old theory, if they're upholding the rules of Islam outwardly, their private life is their own business. So the idea of bringing back the caliphate, anyway, that's something that exists. My point about connecting that with al-Nasir is, here you have a caliph who engaged in a very active program. I mean, he was going to visit the rabats, he was listening to the khutbahs, and so on. He was very engaged in everything that was happening, just completely. And he was trying to restore the caliphate. And so here I would have to say, can you do better than he did? That's my challenge to him. Can you do any better than al-Nasir did? Because he tried his best. And I'm not defending him either, because, of course, he burned the books. He was against the philosophers. And Suhrawardi, on his behalf, wrote a book, Rashf al-Nasa'ih al-Imaniyah wa Kashf al-Fada'ih al-Yunaniyah, against the philosophers and against philosophy and people like Ibn Sab'in and so on. And and then some book burning took place under him, and he had the police organizations and all of that. I mean, if you have a political system, you're going to have something that engages in eventually in less than ideal acts. That's all there is to it. And then what? And so that led Suyuti to say, well, this was just all for political purposes by al-Nasir. He wasn't really sincere. Okay, well, if that's the case, and you have someone who did something that up front looks as good as what al-Nasir did, then what are you going to present? How are you going to present? Do you want to have some kind of totalitarian system where you have something that is just a kind of modern statism? And then when the state itself becomes holy, it's like the state comes and sits on God's throne. And that becomes itself a form of shirk. So this is the problem of that. And then, of course, the thing also was although after Zahir, his son, in turn, al-Mustansir, tried to continue the policy of al-Nasir and did so for his 16 years with some success, but his son, in turn, the great-grandson of al-Nasir al-Mustasim, was killed by the Mongols famously in 1258, and the whole Abbasid Caliphate was obliterated. Even though a possibly fake Abbasid Caliphate was set up in Egypt after that, which had no political power. So the window of the chance for political power was really, in this narrow window of this Abbasid period. And I'm not saying either that what I've said or what I've studied is sufficient coverage of al-Nasir. I think it is a very interesting subject, the whole Caliphate of al-Nasir li-Dīn al-Abbasi, that he presented a kind of model for an Islamic caliphal state. And this is a model that is far more articulated than the earlier models. If you want to go back to the early Abbasids or something like al-Mahdi and the Mansur and Harun al-Rashid and al-Ma'mun and so on, none of whose reigns can be considered ideal either, because always they involve state politics, arrests, imprisonments, judicial murder, and so forth. And how can you get away from that?
Yes, right. Yeah.
So there you have it.
Really, really, really fascinating. Fascinating, mashallah. What's the easiest way that the Khalid for someone to access your writings and your contributions? Because I don't believe that you have a website or anything like that, but
should I?
I think you should. Yeah, maybe we need to get working on that. And there may be some people we know who can help you out with that. Inshallah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but your works, your books and essays and things like that, where can people access?
Well, they're available in various places in various ways. Some of this all can be downloaded illegally and for free from those Russian websites. And the publishers, the Sunni press published The End of the Jihad State and the translation of Tabari. You kindly published Murshid al-Qari. Mm-hmm. And the Brill published the Inimitable Quran. So those are writings that can be gotten that way. The articles can be obtained through JSTOR probably, or some other site through universities if a person has access that way. These things can be obtained, but sometimes the tendency of institutions to try to get money out of things and building paywalls for them and so on makes it difficult.
Right. Alhamdulillah. Dr. Khalid, really do appreciate you taking the time. And hopefully we have other opportunities similar to this one. And really did enjoy the conversation. Always learn something when I'm with you. May Allah bless you and continue to preserve you and increase you in good. Inshallah.
Inshallah. Shukran.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and support. Check the links in the description below to keep up with our work. Thank you.